Rowan Mercer had a rule he never broke, and it had nothing to do with money. He had learned it the hard way, in a childhood full of empty cupboards and a mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Somewhere in those long years, the rule had become the only thing he owned outright. If it was not his, he did not take it. Not the loose change left behind on a diner counter. Not the tools forgotten at a job site. Not the smallest thing that belonged to someone else. At 39, Rowan lived by that rule the way other men lived by religion, quietly and without needing anyone to notice. He worked with his hands because his hands were the only thing that had never let him down. Some weeks it was construction, framing houses for families he would never meet. Other weeks it was moving furniture or fixing fences or driving a delivery van until midnight. He was not the kind of man who complained about any of it. He simply did the work, took the pay, and went home to the small apartment above a hardware store where he had lived for 6 years. The city around him glittered with money he would never touch, glass towers and marble lobbies and cars that cost more than he would earn in a decade. Rowan had made peace with that a long time ago. He did not resent the wealthy. He simply did not think about them, the same way a man does not think about weather in a country he will never visit. On a gray afternoon in late autumn, a light rain falling without urgency, Rowan finished a delivery near the financial district and decided to cut through Ashcombe Square, a quiet plaza wedged between 2 glass towers where office workers ate their lunches on stone benches when the weather allowed. The square was nearly empty. Water beaded on the marble, and there, beside an unoccupied bench, sat a wallet. It was leather, black, worn soft at the corners in the particular way that only expensive things wear, aging gracefully instead of falling apart. Rowan almost walked past it. He had seen enough lost wallets in his life to know most of them belonged to people who would not miss what was inside. And he had seen enough hard winters to know exactly what that kind of money could do for a man like him. He stopped anyway. He picked it up anyway. That was the rule. Inside, he found more cash than he made in 2 months of work. A platinum bank card with a name embossed in silver, a driver's license, and a small photograph, creased from years of being carried, of a young woman standing beside an older man in front of a house Rowan did not recognize. The name on the license read Vivian Ashford. Rowan had heard that name before, the way anyone in this city eventually heard it, attached to boardrooms and charity galas and a company that owned half the buildings he had ever worked construction on. He could have kept the cash and mailed the wallet back anonymously. He could have kept everything and told himself the money would disappear into an account so large the woman would never notice its absence. Instead, he found the address printed on a secondary card tucked behind the license, and he walked the 11 blocks to it in the rain, because a rule broken quietly was still a rule broken, and Rowan Mercer did not break the only thing he had left. The address belonged to a townhouse of pale stone, set back from the street behind an iron gate, the kind of home that did not announce its wealth so much as assume it. Rowan rang the bell and waited, water running down the back of his collar, feeling suddenly aware of his work boots and the mud on his jeans. When the door opened, the woman standing there matched the photograph in the wallet. Older now, her eyes sharper, her expression unreadable in a way that made Rowan instantly uneasy. He held out the wallet. He expected relief. He expected the kind of quick, grateful smile that people gave when something valuable was returned to them. A smile that cost nothing and meant less. Vivian Ashford did not smile. She looked at the wallet in his outstretched hand as though it were something she had been dreading for a very long time. Then she looked at his face, studying it with an intensity that made him want to step back. She did not reach for it right away. "Where did you find this?" she asked, and her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. Rowan told her. "Ashcombe Square, beside the 3rd bench from the fountain, no more than 20 minutes ago." It was a simple answer to a simple question, and he did not understand why her face changed the way it did when he said it, the color draining from it, as though he had spoken a name instead of a location. Vivian Ashford's hand closed around the wallet, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Rowan had expected the conversation to end at the doorstep, a thank you offered and accepted, the rain finally giving him a reason to leave. Instead, Vivian stepped back and asked him to come inside, and there was something in the way she said it, not an invitation so much as a demand dressed carefully in politeness, that made him hesitate before he crossed the threshold. The house was quiet in the particular way that expensive houses are quiet, insulated from the noise of the street, every surface gleaming and untouched. She led him into a study lined with books that looked as though they had never been opened and gestured for him to sit, though she did not sit herself. Instead, she locked the door behind them, a small click that Rowan noticed but did not comment on, and turned to face him with the wallet still in her hand. She asked if he had opened the hidden compartment inside it. Rowan told her the truth, that he had not, that he had looked only long enough to find her name and address before closing it again and walking straight here. Vivian studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether to believe him. Then she sat across from him and began working her thumbnail along a seam in the leather lining that Rowan would never have noticed on his own. The lining came away. A small brass key, no longer than a finger, dropped into her palm. Rowan recognized it instantly, though he could not have said why at first. It was only when he looked closer at the small engraved symbol on its head that the memory surfaced, distant and half-buried, of a building he had walked past as a boy holding his father's hand, a building with that same symbol carved above its doors. "Do you know what this opens?" Vivian asked, holding the key up between them. Rowan said he did not. She did not believe him. He could see it in the way her eyes narrowed, the way she leaned forward slightly, studying his face for a lie that was not there. She began asking questions that had nothing to do with the wallet at all, his full name, his date of birth, the town where he was born, where his mother had worked, what had happened to his father. The questions came quickly, precisely, in the tone of someone conducting an interview rather than making conversation, and Rowan felt the first cold thread of unease work its way up his spine. He asked her finally why any of it mattered. Vivian set the key down on the table between them, very deliberately, and told him something that made the room feel smaller. The wallet had not been lost by accident. It had been placed there, in that square, on that bench, left for exactly the kind of person who would either walk away with the money or walk 11 blocks in the rain to return it. She had been waiting, she said, to see which kind of person would find it. Rowan sat very still. He thought of every choice he had made in the last hour, the money he had not taken, the address he had walked to instead of ignoring. And understood, with a slow, sinking clarity, that he had just passed a test he had never known he was taking. Vivian rose from her chair, crossed to a drawer in the desk behind her, and withdrew a sealed envelope. She did not open it. She only held it, turning it over once in her hands before she looked at Rowan with an expression he could not name, something between grief and disbelief. "I have been looking for a man named Rowan Mercer," she said quietly, "for 12 years. The words did not make sense to him, not at first, and he told her so. He had never met her before today. He had certainly never given anyone reason to search for him for over a decade, not a man who worked construction and delivery routes and lived above a hardware store, a man who had made himself deliberately as small and as forgettable as possible. He stood to leave. He had returned what belonged to her, and whatever strange history she was tangled up in, it could not possibly involve him. Vivian did not try to stop him physically. She simply let him reach the door before she spoke again, her voice pitched low enough that he had to stop to hear it clearly. "If you walk out that door," she said, "you will never know why your father worked for me." Rowan's hand froze on the handle. No one had spoken of his father in years. Not his mother, who had gone quiet on the subject the way people go quiet about a wound that never fully closed, not Rowan himself, who had built an entire adult life around not asking questions he suspected had no good answers. He turned around slowly, and Vivian watched him with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this moment more times than she could count. She told him that his father, Walter Mercer, had once been one of the sharpest financial engineers in a company her family controlled, a man trusted with numbers that most executives never saw, a man who had uncovered something in those numbers that should never have existed, a pattern of transfers, disguised and layered, moving money out of accounts that were never supposed to be touched. Walter had begun documenting it quietly, building a case the way a careful man builds anything, brick by brick, refusing to move until he was certain. But before he could bring what he had found into the light, he vanished from the company entirely, and from the industry altogether. Rowan had grown up believing the simple, painful story his mother had given him. That his father had given up, that he had walked away from a good career for reasons no one ever fully explained, and left his family to manage the wreckage of that decision alone. Vivian told him that story was not true. She opened a drawer and produced a photocopy of an old internal document, its edges soft with age, and slid it across the desk toward him. Rowan's eyes went first to the signature at the bottom. His father's handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years, the same slight upward slant Rowan had seen on birthday cards as a child. But it was the final line of the document that made his stomach drop, a second name typed beneath his father's signature, a name that meant nothing to Rowan and, he could tell from Vivian's face, meant a great deal to her. Gideon Vale. Rowan asked who that was, though something in him had already begun to guess. Vivian told him, her voice flat and careful, that Gideon Vale now sat at the very top of the company her family had built, that he held more power inside it than anyone else alive, and that he had spent years making certain no trace of what Walter Mercer had discovered ever surfaced again. "So why do you need me?" Rowan asked, and the question hung in the quiet room like something with weight. Vivian did not answer right away. Instead, she explained what the brass key opened. A private storage box inside a bank that had closed its doors to the public over a decade ago but still, by some quirk of old contracts, honored its existing accounts. Inside that box, she believed, was a set of records Walter Mercer had left behind before he disappeared from the company for good, records she had spent 12 years trying and failing to access. The access, she explained, had been locked to a single designated heir. Not her, not anyone at the company. Only a man named Rowan Mercer. Whether or not he ever knew the box existed, Rowan wanted no part of it. He told her plainly that whatever had happened over a decade ago belonged to a version of his life he had already buried, that he had built something small and steady out of the wreckage his father left behind, and that he did not intend to dig it back up for a woman he had met an hour earlier. Vivian listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said something that landed harder than anything else she had told him. "You carried that wallet 11 blocks in the rain," she said. "That is exactly how I know you are still his son." The comparison struck a nerve Rowan did not know was still raw. He asked her, sharper now, why she had waited 12 years to come looking for him if any of this mattered as much as she claimed. Vivian's composure slipped, just slightly, for the first time since he had arrived, just enough for him to see something underneath it. She admitted she had tried before, more than once, and each time the trail on Rowan Mercer had gone cold in ways that felt deliberate rather than accidental, records sealed, addresses scrubbed, as though someone had been making certain that if she ever came looking, she would find nothing at all. Rowan sat with that for a long moment, feeling the quiet architecture of his ordinary life shift slightly under his feet, the sense that the plain, unremarkable existence he had built for himself might never have been quite as private as he believed. He agreed to go to the bank. He told himself it was only to close the door on the question properly, to see whatever was inside that box and then walk away from all of it for good. Vivian did not argue with his reasoning. She only nodded and gathered her coat, and the two of them left the townhouse together in a silence that had nothing comfortable left in it. The bank stood on a side street that time seemed to have forgotten, its brass fixtures dulled, its revolving door stiff on its hinges, the kind of building that had once meant something and now existed mostly as a formality. Inside, an elderly clerk led them down to a vault of private boxes without asking many questions, the way people do when a task has been arranged well in advance. Rowan's hand shook slightly as he fit the small brass key into the lock. The box was smaller than he expected. Inside it sat only one thing, a notebook, its cover black leather worn at the spine, the kind of object that had clearly been opened and closed many times by someone who trusted it with things he trusted to nothing else. Rowan lifted it out carefully, aware of Vivian watching him, aware of his own pulse in his throat, and opened the front cover to the very first page. In his father's handwriting, the same slight upward slant, were words that seemed to reach across 12 years and take hold of him by the collar. If Rowan Mercer is reading this, it means I failed. Rowan did not move for a long time. He read the notebook that night alone in the small apartment above the hardware store, the black leather cover opened under a single lamp while the rain returned outside his window. Page after page, his father's careful, cramped handwriting laid out something far larger than Rowan had been prepared for. Dates, numbers, transfers routed through shell accounts with names that meant nothing on the surface and everything underneath, meetings that had never appeared on any official calendar, a slow, patient record of a fraud that had bled money out of a company for years while its board looked the other way. And at the center of nearly every entry, the same name recurring like a heartbeat. Gideon Vale had built his fortune, Rowan understood now, not through brilliance but through theft, dressed carefully in the language of finance, and Walter Mercer had been the one man positioned to see it clearly, and had chosen, against every reasonable instinct for self-preservation, not to look away. But the notebook held something else, something Rowan had not expected at all. Buried in the later pages, past the evidence and the dates, his father had documented something quieter. Before disappearing from the company, Walter had moved a portion of his own accumulated assets, money earned honestly over years of work, into a protective trust, structured so carefully that even a determined search would take years to unravel it. The trust had a single designated beneficiary, held in trust until that beneficiary proved himself ready to receive it, Rowan Mercer. He read the line twice before it settled. He had grown up believing his family owned nothing beyond what fit into 2 suitcases and a rented apartment. He had spent his entire adult life certain that whatever his father had once been, he had left his son nothing but silence and an absent chair at every important moment that followed. Instead, there had been a trust waiting untouched for 12 years, its value compounding quietly while Rowan worked delivery routes to make rent. When he brought this to Vivian the next morning, she confirmed what the notebook implied. The trust was real. It had grown substantially over more than a decade of careful management, enough, she told him plainly, to change the entire shape of his life. But there was a condition attached to it, one his father had insisted on before anyone else in the arrangement, a condition that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with character. The money could only be claimed by a version of Rowan who had not been corrupted by the years in between. The wallet, she admitted, had been the final test of that condition, engineered deliberately, left in a public square to see whether the son Walter Mercer had left behind still carried the same rule his father had lived by. Rowan felt something close to fury rise in his chest. He had been observed, measured, turned into an experiment without his consent, his ordinary act of decency repackaged as a checkbox on someone else's ledger. He told Vivian exactly that, his voice harder than it had been since he arrived at her door. And for the first time, she did not defend herself. She simply admitted that she had not been certain, until he showed up in the rain with that wallet, that he would pass at all. His phone buzzed on the table between them before either of them could say anything else. A message from a number he did not recognize, for words long, "You should not have opened that notebook." Rowan wanted to go straight to the police with what he had, the notebook, the document, the name recurring through every entry like a warning written 12 years too early. Vivian stopped him before he could reach for his phone, her hand closing over his wrist with more urgency than he had seen from her yet. Whatever they held, she told him, would not survive contact with the kind of lawyers Gideon Vale employed. It needed corroboration, chain of custody, evidence that could not be dismissed as the private ramblings of a man who had vanished under a cloud 12 years earlier. Over the following days, Rowan began noticing things he would have dismissed before. A dark sedan parked too long across from the hardware store, its engine running in the cold. A man on his usual delivery route who seemed to appear at inconvenient intervals, never quite close enough to explain, never quite far enough to ignore. His phone filled with messages from unlisted numbers, each one vague enough to deny and specific enough to unsettle, reminders that someone out there knew exactly where he slept and exactly what he had found. He did not run. Running had never been part of the rule he lived by, and he was not about to invent an exception. Now, at night, he found himself standing at the window longer than usual, watching the street below without admitting to himself why, counting the same parked cars twice just to be certain nothing had changed. He told no one at his usual job sites what was happening. He simply kept working, kept moving furniture and framing walls for people who had no idea their delivery man was quietly being watched by someone who owned half the city. Instead, he decided to stop relying only on Vivian's version of events and dig into his father's story on his own terms, starting with the oldest email account he still had access to, one his mother had once used to forward him old family photographs before she passed. Buried among a decade of unopened messages, he found one his father had sent to an address that no longer existed, dated the same week Walter Mercer disappeared from the company for good. The message contained no explanation, no apology, nothing that resembled the goodbye a son might have hoped for, only a single line, written as though his father had known someone besides its intended recipient might read it one day: "Trust the one who returns what is not theirs to keep." Rowan sat with that sentence for a long time, understanding slowly that his father had not simply stumbled into disappearance. He had planned for a future he would not live to see clearly, arranging pieces on a board years in advance, trusting that somewhere down the line his son would still be the kind of man who returned lost wallets in the rain. When he confronted Vivian with what he had found, she did not deny the deeper truth pressing at the edges of the conversation. She told him quietly that Walter Mercer had reached out to her directly before he vanished, not as a colleague but as a father, afraid for a child too young to understand what was coming. He had asked her to watch over Rowan from a distance, to make certain he was safe without ever revealing why, believing that ignorance would keep his son further from Gideon Vale's attention than the truth ever could. Rowan felt something twist in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief but shared the shape of both. Vivian had known him in some fashion for years, had watched pieces of his life unfold from a distance he never suspected, while he believed himself entirely unremarkable, entirely unwatched. He asked her how she could have kept something like that from him for even a single day once he stood in her doorway holding the wallet. Before she could answer, Rowan turned back to the notebook, running his thumb along the edge of a page he had read a dozen times already, and stopped. The signature at the bottom of the final entry, the one attributed to his father, sat slightly wrong beneath his eye, the slant leaning a fraction too far, the loop of the W closed in a way his father had never once closed it in 12 years of birthday cards and grocery lists. It was not his father's signature at all. Rowan's accusation came fast and sharp, the words leaving him before he had fully decided to say them. He told Vivian he believed the entire story, the notebook, the trust, the 12 years of searching, had been constructed to pull him back under her family's influence and hand her renewed control over assets she had lost the right to touch. It was a theory built from anger more than evidence, but it felt in that moment like the only explanation that made sense of how thoroughly his life had been rearranged in the span of a single week. Vivian did not raise her voice in response. She stood very still, absorbing the accusation the way a person absorbs something they had feared hearing for a long time. Then she admitted quietly that there were things she had not told him. Not about the trust, not about the notebook, but about herself, and about the price she had paid 12 years ago to survive inside a company that no longer had room for people who asked too many questions. She told him that Gideon Vale had once forced her hand as well, presenting her with a document to sign that stripped her father's oldest ally, Walter Mercer, of every protection he might have used to defend himself, threatening the collapse of the family's holdings if she refused. She had been young and frightened, and she had signed it, and she had spent every year since trying to undo what that single signature had made possible. Finding Rowan, helping him claim what his father had left behind, was the closest thing to correction she believed she would ever earn. Rowan wanted to believe her, and some tired, guarded part of him still refused. He excused himself, took the notebook to a printing shop 2 blocks from his apartment, and had a technician there examine the handwriting on the disputed signature against a sample from an old birthday card he still carried in his wallet. The comparison confirmed what his eye had already told him. The final entry, the one that read like both confession and threat, had been added by someone else entirely, mimicking Walter Mercer's hand closely enough to fool a casual reader but not closely enough to fool his son. Someone had wanted Rowan to find that notebook, had wanted him to read it, believe it completely, and act on it before anyone verified a single line. And the only person with the access, the motive, and the patience to plant a forged confession 12 years in the making was the same name that appeared throughout every genuine page beside it. Vivian was not the architect of the trap. Gideon Vale was. For the first time since the rain-soaked afternoon in Ashcombe Square, Rowan and Vivian sat on the same side of the table, no longer measuring each other for weakness but working, however uneasily, toward the same conclusion. If Gideon had wanted the notebook found, he had wanted it found for a reason, and neither of them believed that reason had anything to do with justice for a man Gideon had spent 12 years trying to erase. The confirmation came 2 days later, in the parking structure beneath the office where Rowan had gone to have a second document authenticated. He was halfway to his truck when a man stepped out from between two concrete pillars, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that cost more than everything Rowan owned combined, his expression carrying the particular calm of a man who had never once feared consequences. He did not need an introduction. Rowan had seen his photograph often enough by now, cropped into the corner of business articles, standing at podiums beside charts that always seemed to point upward. Gideon Vale studied him the way a man studies a chess piece he had expected to move differently. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the urgency Rowan had felt building in his own chest for days. The overhead lights buzzed faintly between them. Somewhere above, tires echoed against concrete, a car circling toward an upper level, and for a moment neither man spoke at all, each one measuring the other in the silence. Rowan noticed almost absently that Gideon's hands were perfectly still, folded in front of him, the hands of a man who had learned long ago that stillness could be its own kind of threat. "So you finally found what I wanted you to find," Gideon said, and smiled in a way that made the parking structure feel colder than it was. Gideon Vale did not waste time on threats disguised as small talk. He told Rowan plainly that the notebook, the trust, the entire 12-year architecture Walter Mercer had left behind, could be resolved cleanly and quietly if Rowan handed over everything he had found, in exchange for a sum large enough to make every worry he had ever carried disappear. He said the number aloud, deliberately, watching Rowan's face for the flicker of desire that most men could not hide when confronted with that kind of money. Rowan did not flinch. He had spent his entire life without that kind of money, and had learned slowly, without choosing to, that its absence had never been the thing that frightened him most. He told Gideon no, simply, without embellishment, and watched something shift behind the older man's composed expression, a thin crack in a surface that had clearly not been challenged in a very long time. Gideon's tone sharpened. He reminded Rowan exactly what he was. A man who patched together a living from delivery routes and construction sites, a man with no standing, no resources, and no real chance of surviving a fight against an empire built over decades. He said it the way a man says something he believes is simply true, not cruelty so much as arithmetic, and waited for Rowan to understand the math and back down. Rowan only asked one question in return. "If you're so certain you'll win," he said, "why does my silence need a price tag at all?" The question landed harder than Rowan expected. Gideon's composure slipped for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Rowan to see the fear underneath the confidence. By the time the older man recovered enough to respond, Rowan had already turned and walked back toward his truck, leaving the offer sitting unclaimed in the cold concrete air behind him. That night, Rowan and Vivian stopped chasing the notebook's forged confession and began instead to trace the original transactions Walter Mercer had documented years earlier, working backward through shell accounts and buried filings with the help of a forensic accountant Vivian trusted from outside the company entirely, someone with no history and nothing to gain from either side of the fight. Piece by piece, the picture Walter had assembled 12 years ago came back into focus, no longer a private notebook that could be dismissed as one man's grievance, but a documented pattern, independently verified, buried inside the oldest filings. Rowan found something neither he nor Vivian had expected. The trust his father established was not simply a sum of money set aside for a future son. It carried, attached to it, a controlling block of voting shares in the very company Gideon Vale now ran, shares that had been quietly excluded from every count of Gideon's influence because they were legally locked to an heir the company's own records listed as unlocatable. Rowan Mercer was not merely owed money. He held, without ever knowing it, the single largest vote inside the company that had spent 12 years trying to erase every trace of his father. The company's annual shareholder meeting, already scheduled weeks earlier and impossible for Gideon to postpone without raising exactly the kind of questions he had spent over a decade avoiding, became the only place left where the truth could be spoken loudly enough to matter. Rowan walked into the room in a borrowed suit that did not quite fit him, Vivian beside him carrying a folder of verified documents, and felt every head in the room turn toward the two of them with open curiosity. Gideon saw him from across the room and laughed, a short, dismissive sound meant to remind everyone present exactly how little a man like Rowan Mercer belonged there. The laugh did not last. A secretary at the front of the room rose with a printed authorization in her hand, cleared her throat, and addressed the assembled board and shareholders in a voice that carried easily to every corner of the hall. "Allow me to introduce the holder of the largest voting share in this room." Rowan delivered the evidence the way his father might have, methodically, without theater, letting the document speak louder than his own voice ever could. Gideon tried briefly to paint him as an outsider with no legitimate claim to anything happening in that room, a stranger who had wandered in off the street with a stolen story, but the forensic accounting Vivian had commissioned left no room for that argument to survive contact with the numbers. Bank records, transfer logs, dates that lined up with the original notebook entries down to the day. Vivian stood beside Rowan and confirmed, on record, the document she had signed 12 years earlier under pressure, and the circumstances under which Gideon Vale had forced her hand. Her testimony, coming from someone who had spent over a decade inside the company's inner circle, carried a weight that Rowan's evidence alone could not have achieved. Board members who had spent years avoiding uncomfortable questions about Gideon's rise began, one by one, to ask exactly the questions they had avoided for so long. By the time outside investigators were formally invited into the room, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Gideon Vale was stripped of his operating authority before the meeting adjourned, his name attached now to an inquiry that would take months to fully unravel, his empire suddenly far smaller and far more fragile than it had appeared from the outside for over a decade. Rowan found himself in the aftermath standing in a position he had never once imagined for himself, holding enough influence to reshape a company that employed thousands of people who had never done anything to deserve the corruption sitting quietly above them. Board members who had spent the meeting distancing themselves from Gideon now approached him with a different kind of attention, careful and calculating, already imagining what a man in his position might be persuaded to do with that much power. Vivian asked him directly what he intended to do with it. There was no accusation in the question, only genuine curiosity, the kind of question one careful person asks another when the answer is not yet obvious. Rowan thought about the years his mother had spent working 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, about every delivery route and framing job that had taught him more about integrity than any boardroom ever could, and told her the only answer that felt honest. Money did not prove a person was good, he said. Only what they did with it proved that. Instead of taking control of the company outright, Rowan proposed something else entirely, a transparency fund built into the company's structure, protections for employees who noticed wrongdoing and had nowhere safe to report it, the kind of safeguard his own father might have used 12 years earlier, if it had existed. He did not want to become the next man sitting comfortably at the top of an empire built on other people's silence. He had seen exactly where that road ended. Vivian watched him lay out the proposal to a room full of people twice his net worth and far more accustomed to power than he would ever be, and something in her expression shifted permanently, respect settling into features that had until recently only known suspicion and calculation when she looked at him. When the meeting finally ended, she reached into her bag and set the original leather wallet, the one that had started all of it, back onto the table between them. "There is still one answer I never gave you," she said. Rowan asked her finally why a simple lost wallet had unraveled into all of this, a fortune, a conspiracy, a father he thought he understood and had never truly known at all. Vivian told him the wallet had never been a test of money, not really. It had been the final piece of an arrangement his father designed years before his own disappearance, long before Rowan was old enough to understand any of it. Walter Mercer, she said, had once told her that if his son ever came across something valuable enough to change his life, the only thing that mattered was what Rowan chose to do in the quiet moment before anyone was watching. She had kept that instruction for 12 years, carrying it the way some people carry grief, waiting for a stranger in the rain to prove whether a father's faith in his son had been justified. Then she told him the line that struck harder than anything else in the entire ordeal, quiet and direct, the kind of sentence that rearranges everything a person believes about themselves. "You did not return that wallet to me," she said. "You returned it to the man your father always hoped you would become." Rowan sat with that for a long moment, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tightly wound since childhood. The old ache of believing himself abandoned by a father who had, it turned out, never stopped watching from a distance, never stopped believing, never stopped building a bridge across 12 years so that his son might one day walk it and find him waiting on the other side, even if only in ink and old signatures and a single locked notebook. He had inherited money, yes, more than he had ever expected to see in one lifetime. But what settled into him more deeply than the number in any bank statement was the understanding that his father had never given up on him, had never walked away without reason, had spent his final working years quietly building a path forward for a son he loved enough to protect from a distance rather than risk pulling him into danger too soon. Vivian offered him a role overseeing the new transparency fund alongside her, a genuine partnership rather than a gesture of gratitude, and Rowan accepted on one condition: that every decision the fund made would be open to scrutiny, nothing hidden, nothing buried the way his father's discoveries had once been buried for 12 long years. Over the months that followed, something quieter grew between them, unhurried and unforced, built not on the drama of the wallet or the boardroom but on the ordinary accumulation of trust, long conversations over coffee that had nothing to do with shares or fraud, the discovery that Vivian laughed more easily than her public reputation ever suggested, that Rowan noticed details about her that had nothing to do with the empire she had inherited. There was no sudden declaration, no dramatic gesture borrowed from a story neither of them was living inside. Only two people who had each been shaped by loss, finding, slowly, that they trusted each other with the quiet parts of themselves they had long since stopped showing anyone. On a clear evening many months later, Rowan stood in the apartment he had finally allowed himself to leave behind, packing the last of his belongings into boxes bound for a home that still felt too large for a man who had once measured his life in delivery routes. He held the old leather wallet in his hands one final time before setting it gently into a drawer, not as a trophy but as a reminder of the ordinary decision that had quietly rearranged everything that came after it. Vivian watched him from the doorway, arms crossed loosely, an easy warmth in her expression that had replaced the careful distance of their first meeting entirely. "If you could go back to that day," she asked, "would you pick it up again?" Rowan closed the drawer slowly and turned to face her, the faint trace of a smile settling into features that had spent so many years guarded against exactly this kind of happiness. "I would still pick it up," he said. "But this time, I would know I was picking up more than a wallet. I would know I was picking up a future I never knew was waiting for me." Vivian crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to watch the last of the daylight fade over rooftops neither of them had grown up believing they would ever look down on. It was Rowan who broke the silence, quietly, almost to himself, saying that his father had never gotten to see any of this, the fund, the company, the son he had once written to in the dark without knowing whether the words would ever be read. Vivian told him gently that perhaps his father had seen enough. He had seen a boy who never once took what did not belong to him, even when no one was watching, even when a single choice might have made his whole life easier. "That," she said, had been the only proof he ever needed. Outside, the city moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the quiet reversal that had just taken place inside one ordinary life, unaware that somewhere among its glass towers and crowded sidewalks, a single act of honesty, offered without any expectation of reward, had opened a door that a tired, overlooked man had never known he was standing in front of.